A major blow to the government's Brexit strategy. The High Court rules it must have the approval of Parliament. Campaigners for MPs to get a vote were jubilant. Ministers say they're disappointed and will appeal.
The result today is about all of us. It's not about me or my team. It's about our United Kingdom and all our futures.
The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum. This judgment raises important and complex matters of law, and it's right that we consider it carefully before deciding how to proceed.
The government says it's committed to triggering the process to leave the EU next year, but the UKIP leader says he fears a betrayal may be near at hand. Also this lunchtime, the latest economic forecast from the Bank of England. Growth and inflation are higher than expected, and there's no cut in interest rates. Sir Philip Green offers £250 million to mend the pension problems at BHS, £100 million short of what the regulator wants. More children are leaving primary school overweight or obese than ever before, and the levels are rising. And the Oaxaca restaurant chain closes branches as hundreds of people contract the winter vomiting bug.
Here, the Bishop of Oxford's been defending himself over claims he ignored reports of child sex abuse in the 1980s. And fundraising for Freddie, another family's campaign to get proton beam therapy for their son's cancer.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The government has suffered a highly significant Brexit defeat in the High Court, with judges ruling that it needs Parliament's approval to trigger the process of the UK leaving the European Union. The government had until now resisted giving MPs such a vote, with the Prime Minister Theresa May saying she would trigger the process by March next year. The government has responded to the ruling, saying it's disappointed and that it will appeal. Today's court decision raises major questions about the path to Brexit, as well as constitutional issues about the role of Parliament. More on that in a moment, but first with the morning's events. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
Her victory is a massive setback for the government. This is Gina Miller, a fund manager. She argued Parliament must have a vote before ministers begin to take Britain out of the EU, and the judges agreed.
The result today is about all of us. It's not about me or my team. It's about our United Kingdom and all our futures. It's not about how anyone voted. Every one of us voted for the best country and the best future. This case was about process, not politics.
This hugely important case revived referendum arguments outside the court, but this was not about whether Britain should stay in or out of the EU. It was about the government's plan to trigger Article 50 and begin Britain's divorce from the European Union without MPs having a say first. And there has been a growing clamour from across the Commons for exactly that.
I think it is an important decision that says, something as fundamental to our constitution, this should be decided by Parliament and not by the executive, i.e. the government.
And if there is now a vote in Parliament, some MPs say they will not give the government the go-ahead to begin Brexit.
I will be voting not to trigger Article 50. But in a sense, this isn't about how I'm voting, it's about whether you believe in a sovereign Parliament.
The government wants to trigger Article 50 by the end of March next year, but that timetable could now be derailed. If Parliament gets a vote on legislation before Britain begins its exit from the European Union, then MPs and peers could demand to know much more about the government's negotiation plans first, or even block Brexit from happening. The government was quick to confirm it will appeal to the Supreme Court in December.
Mr. Speaker, the government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum. This judgment raises important and complex matters of law, and it's right that we consider it carefully before deciding how to proceed.
And other Leave campaigners insisted the referendum result had to be delivered.
I actually think it's the wrong decision to make. What was very clear at the time was that the British people, when we passed that Act of Parliament, were handed back the right to make the decision whether we stayed or left the European Union.
This case was about fundamental principles of power and democracy. Its potential impact on how Brexit happens, huge. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's talk to Norman Smith, our assistant political editor, who's at the High Court for us. And Norman, this feels like a hammer blow for the government. How do they handle this?
Well, Rita, there's a famous painting by an artist called Edvard Munch, and it's called The Scream. And I suspect there are people in Downing Street this morning doing a pretty good impression of that, going, what do we do? Because today's decision, frankly, plunges Mrs May's Brexit plans into near chaos, derailing her efforts to get this started by the end of March and derailing her ambitions of going into the negotiations with a free hand. Because if, as the court suggests, you need an act of parliament now to trigger Article 50, that could take many, many months. More than that, it would have to go through the House of Lords, where there's a clear majority against the government, and it would enable critical MPs to table amendments imposing conditions on Mrs May, such as she has to ensure we remain a member of the single market. Two little bits of hope for the government. One is that the Supreme Court overturn today's decision. Two is that they can find a way of consulting Parliament without having to have a new act to trigger Article 50. But you know, Rita, there is one thing in my experience which senior politicians hate more than anything, and it's losing control. And today, Mrs May lost control of her Brexit agenda after the court decided Parliament, and not her, should decide when we trigger Article 50.
Norman, as ever, thank you. Well, our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman is here with me. And Clive, where does this legally go from here?
Well, legally, the government now have permission to leapfrog the Court of Appeal and take their appeal straight to the Supreme Court. Now, that should be heard, I would think, in the early part of December. And I'm being told that the Supreme Court is considering having all 11 Supreme Court justices sit in that case. That has never ever happened before. But what I think this morning really points up is perhaps something that we can describe as the constitutional tension of our times. And that is the tension between an executive, a government, very powerful, likes to get its way on everything, and the tension between that and the independent judiciary, who through the means of judicial review can hear a case brought by a citizen, you or I, that questions the lawfulness of a decision of government. Today we've seen that very powerfully. The judges have delivered something of a legal hammer blow to the government. It has stopped them in their tracks, and that is how our constitution works.
OK, Clive, many thanks. Well, let's go now to Brussels and to speak to our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly. And Kevin, there's been something of a resounding silence from the EU Commission on this ruling. What do we read into that?
Yep, you can pick your own way to describe the silence. Resounding, thoughtful, deafening. I think no one here knows quite what to say this afternoon. Now, that's partly because, of course, there's a consciousness that national court decisions are always complex, and the political consequences of them, as they are this afternoon in the UK, are unpredictable. We do know there's going to be a phone conversation tomorrow between the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and the Prime Minister, Theresa May, and that will be a fascinating conversation. Be good to know the content of that conversation, of course, and the tone of it. We'll hear more about that over the coming 24 hours. What we can say, I think, from Europe is that all through the Brexit process, there's been an appetite from some European politicians for the UK to get this done and get it done quickly, to end political uncertainty in Europe. There are others who are romantics, I think, who hope that somehow Brexit can still be avoided. And in the light of this court decision, you can perhaps add a third camp to all of that. People who just think there has to be clarity from the UK, and there has to be clarity pretty quickly. And there's a sense in Brussels this afternoon that that is one thing that's not coming from Britain on this issue.
Kevin, thank you very much. Kevin Connolly there. The Bank of England has kept interest rates on hold and raised its economic outlook for this year and the next. But it warned that tough times were still ahead and cut its forecast for 2018, predicting lagging growth and a bigger rise in the cost of living. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity reports.
Goods prices have been hammered down now for years, falling, not rising. It's only higher prices for services that have pushed up the cost of living. But inflationary pressure's growing because of the weak pound. Companies like this Buckinghamshire chairmaker are paying a fifth more for imported raw materials like timber. They can try and shave other costs and absorb it, But unless they want reduced profits, they'll soon have to pass on the pain in higher prices. Today, the Bank of England warned that pent-up inflationary pressure would push inflation above the target. The forecast is it will reach 2.75% by the end of next year. Nothing like the inflation of the past, perhaps, but the highest forecast the bank's made in years.
CPI inflation is expected to be higher throughout the 3-year forecast period than in the committee's August projections. This is largely the result of the renewed depreciation of sterling.
So far, the cost of living stayed under control, up just 1% at the last count. But inflation driven by the weak pound will soon come home to us. In October, petrol prices rose faster than they have in 3.5 years, threatening a renewed squeeze on living standards. Goods that use imported materials, like carpets and floorings, are edging up. And if you want a cuppa to console yourself, watch out. Tea from India is priced in dollars. Expect the price to rise.
If you ask most consumers if they'd love or hate more inflation, you'll get a pretty clear, emphatic answer: no thank you. But to the Bank of England, we haven't had enough of it for years, and frankly, it would like a bit more.
There's a large amount of debt in the economy, and consumers have debt in forms of mortgages and so on, and inflation helps pay off those debts. They don't want inflation, however, being too high, because that squeezes incomes. It means you don't have enough money to buy the things you used to, and you feel worse off.
The pound strengthened by about a cent against both the euro and the dollar today, following the court ruling requiring the government to get Parliament's approval to trigger a Brexit. Unfortunately, that rise is not enough to throw inflation driven by the weak pound into reverse. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Pensions regulator has launched enforcement action against the former owner of BHS, Sir Philip Green, warning him to help plug the nearly £600 million deficit in the company's pension scheme. Sir Philip Green says he's already presented a credible proposal. The BBC understands the regulator wants £350 million from Sir Philip. He's offering £250 million. Here's our business correspondent, Emma Simpson.
When the doors closed on BHS, the shops went and its pension schemes were left with an enormous black hole and some 20,000 former workers facing a hit to their retirement. In the summer, Sir Philip Green made this promise.
It's resolvable, sortable, we will sort it, we will find a solution.
But now it seems the pensions regulator has lost its patience and wants to force him to pay. MPs are backing it.
We've seen negotiations about trying to do a deal when it comes to BHS pensioners for months. Philip Green said he'd sort it. He said that in Parliament in June. We're now in November and no progress has really been made. And so why the regulator has done what it's done, I can absolutely understand. It's a sign of frustration.
The regulator has now issued a warning notice to Sir Philip, detailing why it believes he and his family's companies should cough up.
It does it very, very rarely. It's a very long, slow, complex process. If it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, it could take many, many years. I think the chances of the pensions regulator being ultimately successful are no more than 50-50.
In a statement, Sir Philip said he'd provided the regulator with what he believed to be a credible and substantial proposal, with evidence and bank confirmation of cash availability, which would prevent the scheme from entering the Pension Protection Fund. This was in order to achieve a better outcome for the BHS pensioners. The pension regulator didn't think it was credible enough. It's also pursuing the other former owner, Dominic Chappell, the man in charge when BHS went bust, consigning these stores to history. The starting gun's now been fired on a long and tortuous legal battle, although the regulator says it's still open to a deal. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
More than 2,000 extra frontline staff are to be recruited to work in prisons in England and Wales to help tackle rising violence and drug abuse. The Justice Secretary Liz Truss plans to fight what she's called the toxic cocktail of drugs, drones and mobile phones being smuggled into jails. She says the new recruits should help to reduce attacks on staff and prisoners. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly reports.
This is what ministers would like inmates to be doing. Training for life on the outside in a prison workshop. But in many jails, this is the reality. Mayhem on the wings, with overstretched staff simply trying to keep control. With assaults on the rise, more than 2,000 new prison officers are to be recruited to try to make jails safer for staff and inmates. The Justice Secretary, Liz Truss, here on a visit to Brixton Prison in South London, has described levels of violence as unacceptable.
What steps do you think we most need to take to reduce levels of violence?
And today in the Commons, she announced what's being billed as the biggest overhaul of prisons in England and Wales for a generation.
I believe we can create a better system with pronounced and sustained improvement in results for offenders, in their education, employment and health, so that those stubborn reoffending rates can come down and fewer people have to go through the terrifying ordeal of being a victim of crime.
So what else is the government proposing? Well, there'll be testing of offenders for drug use when they arrive at and leave prison. Inmates' maths and English will also be tested, and these results will be part of new prison league tables. A recent problem is drones being used to smuggle in drugs and phones. That was what was in the package attached to this drone. To stop this, there's a plan for no-fly zones over jails. But on staffing, 2,000 more are still not enough, according to the Prison Officers Association.
I'm not even sure they'll be able to recruit and retain those individuals, simply because the salary and terms and conditions have been tampered with, and as fast as individuals are being recruited, they're leaving again because of the violence contained within our jails.
And it's emerged that all the new staff will not be brought in quickly. The plan is to have them in place by the end of 2018. June Kelly, BBC News.
The time is 17 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. A major blow to the government's Brexit strategy. The High Court rules it must have the approval of Parliament. And still to come, we're on the front line with Iraqi special forces as they push into the IS-held city of Mosul.
And in South today, fundraising for Freddie and other families campaign to get proton beam therapy to treat their son's brain tumour. And anger at the so-called cash cow camera, which has been placed on a bus lane outside a busy hospital.
As the operation continues to take control of the Iraqi city of Mosul from militants of self-styled Islamic State, Iraqi special forces are trying to secure an eastern area of the city, which they took from IS yesterday. Our correspondent Ayman Agana is embedded with those Iraqi forces and was with them when they entered the suburb of Gojali. Well, Ayman is now away from Mosul, 50 miles east in the city of Erbil, from where he joins us now. Ayman.
Nearly 2.5 years ago, so-called Islamic State captured Iraq's second city. I spent the last 3 weeks with Iraq's special forces as they fought their way back into the city and challenged the Islamic State head-on. We're headed towards Gojali, which is the first part of Mosul city. To be honest, I'm a little bit nervous. So far, this convoy has only gone through very small towns and villages, and the resistance hasn't been that much. But I think what we're going to face is going to be a lot more severe.
هدفنا يبعد 1500 متر بس اكو رمايه معاديه من العدو وهوانات.
We've now entered the eastern side of Mosul. This is the first time Iraqi soldiers have been here in over 2 years of Islamic State occupation. We're seeing a lot of resistance. A sniper bullet hit our window. So after a long, expensive and bloody campaign for over 2.5 years, these men are the first government forces to enter the city of Mosul.
حلالنا السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
الله يساعدكم. الله يربحكم. الله يبقيكم. حلالنا من البارح البقري ما ورد.
هسه شريد من عندك. طب بعائلتك وعد من اقول لك ورتين ورتين.
جزاك الله.
يلا. لان عائلتك لا يشوفونك الطيار يضرب.
So we've arrived now in eastern Mosul and we've found a group of civilians who've been hiding in a room. They're prevented from leaving the city from IS, and the soldiers are here now talking to them, and they sincerely look very relieved to have been liberated from IS.
11 طلقة زي الطلقة. هذا دبابة وهاي كله على الأسلحة. الدراسة على الأسلحة يعني نفس المواصفات.
وانا اسعى ولدي عندي ولد يستحقون يعني يدخلون هاي من هذيك السنه اثنيناتهم ما درستهم.
تعال حجي
ما درستهم.
غديت؟ تعال قل. كلها.
So we've seen big success militarily with Iraq's special forces entering the city, but the real challenges will be maintaining that peace behind the front lines. Let's not forget that 2.5 years ago when IS first entered Mosul, they were greeted as liberators. So the government has many challenges in making sure this marginalised community feels that they have a new part in this new country.
Eamon, many thanks. There are reports this lunchtime that 2 boats carrying migrants have sunk off the coast of Libya. The United Nations says nearly 240 people have died. So far, only 2 survivors have been brought ashore on the Italian island of Lampedusa. The chain of Mexican restaurants Oaxaca closed 9 of its branches after a suspected outbreak of the norovirus, which causes diarrhoea and vomiting. More than 350 staff and customers have fallen ill, but the source of the outbreak isn't yet known. Public Health England has begun an inquiry into the incident, and the company has apologised and said it's deep cleaned all of its restaurants. 4 of the branches remain closed. Sophie Long reports.
David Blackwell ate a selection of food at Work Do at Oaxaca in Soho last Thursday. By the weekend, he said he felt seriously ill.
It's made us really, really ill, really sick, really nauseous, aches and pains. It's made my wife ill, she's caught it from me. You know, it's not very pleasant at all.
David was not alone. Public Health England say so far they've been made aware of 205 staff and 160 members of the public reporting illness. However, they say these are unconfirmed cases, and currently the source of the outbreak is not confirmed and remains under investigation.
So the cause of the infection remains unknown, yet the restaurant chain have now reopened 5 that were closed because people had been feeling ill. They say they'll reopen the 4 that remain shut, like this one in central London, as soon as they feel able to do so.
At the moment, the chairs remain stacked on tables here, and people looking for tacos and tequila will have to look elsewhere. In a statement, Oaxaca said, "We took our own precautionary measures, voluntarily closing affected restaurants. We have done everything within our power to limit any risk to our customers and team members." Thomasina Myers opened the chain in 2005 after winning MasterChef with her Mexican-themed food. At Oaxaca, she says she tries to balance healthy eating with hearty eating. Norovirus can be very unpleasant, but it's rarely serious. Most people make a full recovery within 1 or 2 days. The restaurant chain say they are incredibly sorry that people have been unwell, and they're doing everything they can to get to the bottom of how this may have happened. Sophie Long, BBC News, Central London.
More children are leaving primary school overweight or obese than ever before, and the levels are increasing. That's according to the latest figures from the government, which show the percentage of overweight and obese 10 to 11-year-olds is the highest on record. Here's Gillian Hargreaves.
3, 2, 1. Musana Hussain hasn't been chosen for the minor counties yet, but with 147 runs in 5 minutes, surely it's only a matter of time. Denby Primary in Luton is a sporty school. Woven into every lesson, they even do maths games in the school yard. 5 times table. OK, off you go. Specially trained PE teacher Tyrone West teaches his colleagues how to run effective sports lessons. The result? Lean, fit, happy children. They're all physically active, and they're physically active in the classroom as well. So we do have active classrooms and active interventions.
It's been promoted from a young age. The whole school takes part in whole school fitness every single day.
But Denby is bucking the trend because new figures out today show an increase in the number of obese children in England, more than 1 in 3. There are regional differences. Richmond-on-Thames has the lowest figure for 4-year-olds compared to Middlesbrough, which has the highest. And boys are more obese than girls. Even professional athletes are concerned.
Major games inspire sporty children. That's brilliant, and it might inspire a few others. But we've got to look beyond that, and you know, teaching's a tough profession to go into. Families need to look at what they do with their children. If we don't do something now, it'll have such major implications on the whole of society, on pensions, on the NHS. It's actually something we can't afford to push into the long grass.
And yet, with teachers receiving only about 6 hours of sports training at college, many say they're underconfident about getting children moving.
I like it, but I'm going to challenge you a bit more.
As these 7- and 10-year-olds show, children are not naturally couch potatoes. Given the right tools and a bit of help from adults, they have the imagination and enthusiasm to lead full and active lives. Gillian Hargreaves, BBC News.
A doctor who was struck off the medical register for what was described as dishonest and misleading evidence as an expert witness in so-called shaken baby cases has been cleared of dishonesty. A High Court judge today found there were significant flaws in the medical tribunal's findings against Dr. Wayne Squire. She will now be allowed to continue practising as a doctor, but has been banned from giving expert evidence in court cases for several years. The General Medical Council brought the charges, but has yet to comment. This report from our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt does contain some flash photography.
Dr. Wayne Squire arriving at the High Court today to hear a judgment that cleared her of giving dishonest evidence in cases where it's claimed a child has been killed or harmed by being shaken. In March, a tribunal struck her off the medical register for being dogmatic and misleading in court. But today, a judge ruled that there were significant flaws in the tribunal's findings, concluding that although Dr. Squire, a leading paediatric neuropathologist, had strayed beyond her expertise at times, her opinions were honestly held.
To have been accused of misleading the courts, why should I do that? Why should I want to? How would I set about it? I've simply gone to court to express my view using the best evidence I have available to me at the time.
In the past, Dr. Squire's evidence has helped clear the names of people like Suzanne Holdsworth, a babysitter wrongly convicted of shaking a toddler in her care. Dr. Squire questions the bleeding and swelling on the brain and bleeding behind the eyes that most doctors say is generally a sign a child has been shaken. Throughout this case, Dr. Squire has maintained that she's been scapegoated because she challenges the science that lies behind a diagnosis that a child has been shaken. And this is an area where the stakes are extremely high. Defence barristers warn the pressure Dr. Squire has faced has made it difficult to get experts to appear in these cases.
Unless you've got a scientist who will say, well, we don't accept this, we don't accept these symptoms as being necessarily indicative of shaking a baby or smothering a baby, then you're in a parlous state. You're in a very difficult position. The judge concluded there had been serious professional misconduct by Dr. Squire, and he restricted her ability to give evidence in court, but she has now been reinstated as a doctor. Alison Holt, BBC News.
The English and Scottish Football Association say they'll defy world football's governing body and wear black armbands with poppies on. The two teams are due to play each other in their World Cup qualifier on Armistice Day. Our sports correspondent Richard Conway reports.
Next week, Wembley Stadium will play host to the oldest rivalry in world football. But England and Scotland will stand united on Armistice Day and wear armbands bearing